It was late in the evening when my phone buzzed, and I remember glancing down with a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, my son had remembered. But as I opened the screen, all I saw was a short message from David. It was 3 days after my birthday, and the words were so casual, so careless. They barely landed at all. He said happy birthday as if it were an afterthought, and then added that I should have reminded him. My heart sank. After everything I had given, after the years I had poured my energy, my time, and my love into him, I was now responsible for reminding my own child that I had been born. I sat there staring at that message, letting it sting like salt in a wound I didn't even know was still open. Memories ran through me like a film reel birthday cakes I had baked from scratch. Late nights when I stayed up sewing costumes. The countless checks I had written without hesitation. I had told myself these sacrifices were love, that giving endlessly would be enough to hold our family together. But in that moment, I realized all I had done was teach him that my love was automatic, expected, and without boundaries. The disbelief slowly hardened into something else. For years, I had brushed off little slights, overlooked the cold silences, forgiven the selfish demands. But that text, those few careless words, snapped something inside me. I couldn't let this continue. I wouldn't. I remember setting down my coffee, taking a deep breath, and opening my laptop. My hands shook, not with weakness, but with resolve. I logged into the family trust account, the one that had supported David and his household for years. I moved through the options deliberately, not second-guessing myself this time. Within minutes, every automatic transfer was canceled. His mortgage, the tuition, the endless stream of bills they would no longer be fed by me. As I closed the screen, a strange calm settled over me. It felt almost unfamiliar, like slipping into a new skin. I knew what was coming, the calls, the panic, the disbelief, but for the first time in decades, I felt the balance shift. I had drawn a line, and I was ready to see what happened when the money stopped flowing. And as I sat back in the quiet of my apartment, I realized this story was only beginning. The birthday text was just the spark. The firestorm would come next. For most of my life, I lived in a quiet apartment in New York, a place Robert and I had shared for decades. It was comfortable, even elegant in its own way, filled with memories of a marriage built on hard work and steady devotion. After Robert passed, the space became quieter. Almost too quiet, but at least it was mine. Meanwhile, my son David and his wife leaned on me for nearly everything. Their dream house in the suburbs, the private schools for their children, the endless renovations and luxuries, it was all funded by the checks I signed without hesitation. At first, I told myself it was what any loving mother would do. I wanted David's family to feel secure, to enjoy a life free of financial strain. But over time, I realized that while I was making sacrifices, they were simply making demands. Each month, transfers left my account, covering their mortgage, their cars, even the small indulgences that added up to thousands. The generosity I thought would bind us together only seemed to distance us further. I still made the drive out every Sunday, winding through traffic to sit at their table. I brought groceries, baked goods, small gifts, anything to show I cared. But once I arrived, I often felt invisible. Conversations swirled around me, filled with talk of contractors, new furniture, and vacations I had unknowingly financed. My daughter-in-law scrolled her phone, barely acknowledging me. My grandchildren offered polite smiles, but rarely more. I was present, but I was not seen. What hurt most were the small moments, the little signs of neglect that chipped away at me, the quick glances at their watches when I spoke too long, the way David's tone grew hurried whenever I called just to check in. I had become a fixture, reliable as the automatic deposits that landed in their accounts. Not a mother, not a grandmother, just the silent provider. And yet, I clung to the belief that loyalty meant sacrifice, that if I continued to give, eventually they would give something back. Love, attention, appreciation, anything. I convinced myself that family was worth the price, even as the cost grew unbearable. It wasn't until my birthday came and went, until the silence in my kitchen grew heavier than ever before, that the truth began to settle in. All my sacrifices had bought me was absence, and soon, that absence would break me in a way I hadn't expected. I still remember the smell of chocolate filling my little kitchen that morning. My hands ached as I whisked the batter, every movement stiff from arthritis. But I didn't care. David had always loved this cake since he was a boy. For decades, it was my tradition, his tradition too, or so I believed. I told myself that even if life had grown complicated, even if distance had crept into our relationship, a slice of that cake could bring him back to me, if only for a few hours. I set the cake on the counter, frosting it carefully, and sent him a short message letting him know it was ready whenever he wanted to stop by. I spent the rest of the day waiting. Every time a car slowed outside, I peeked through the curtain, expecting to see his silver sedan. Every buzz of my phone made my heart jump, only to sink again when it wasn't him. Morning stretched into afternoon, and by the time evening shadows crept across the walls, I was still alone at the table. That night, I left the cake untouched, convincing myself he'd come tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and then another day, and then another. 3 days later, the cake sat stale on the counter, a silent reminder of hope that had withered, with tears in my eyes. I slid it into the trash, the sound of it falling against the bin echoing louder than it should have. It felt as if I was throwing away not just dessert, but decades of devotion. On the 4th day, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was him. A short message, a half-hearted happy birthday late, careless, and then the words that stopped me cold. I should have reminded him, as if it were my responsibility to make sure my son remembered the day his own mother came into the world. Something inside me hardened. For years, I had been the giver, the forgiver, the one who made excuses. But at that moment, staring at that shallow text, I realized the old version of me, the one who swallowed every slight, was gone. I had reached the breaking point. The sorrow began to shift into something sharper, steadier, a quiet resolve. I knew then that things could not go on the way they had, and soon I would prove it not with words, but with action. The morning after that text, I woke up with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. My chest was heavy, but my mind was sharp. I reached for the phone, not to call David, but to call my lawyer. My voice trembled at first, yet underneath it was a current of resolve. I explained that I wanted every automatic transfer, every scheduled payment from the trust, stopped immediately, no exceptions, no delays. As the lawyer confirmed the steps, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over me. Fear, because I knew what this meant for David and his family. Relief, because for the first time in so long, I was drawing a line. The process itself was simple, just a few clicks, a few signed forms, but emotionally, it felt monumental. Years of sacrifice, erased in minutes. When the final confirmation email came through, I sat back in my chair, staring at the quiet apartment around me. It was almost surreal how quickly the tables had turned. All these years, I had believed I was powerless, trapped by my own sense of duty. Now, with one decision, I had shifted the balance. It didn't take long for the storm to arrive. My phone lit up with calls from David, then from his wife. At first, I let it buzz, watching the screen flash their names. Then came the messages, growing increasingly frantic questions, complaints, confusion. I didn't answer. I just sat there in silence, holding the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of their panic. For once, it wasn't my problem to fix. There was a flicker of satisfaction in that moment, a quiet triumph I had never allowed myself before. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I had spent decades giving until there was nothing left of me. Now, I was keeping something for myself, my dignity. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Their panic was just the first wave. The real storm, the begging, the guilt trips, the false promises was still on its way. And as the calls kept coming, I braced myself. I was ready to see how far they would go now that the money was gone. The first week after I cut the money was chaos. My phone seemed to ring every hour. David's name flashed across the screen again and again, followed by his wife's. Then came the emails, subject lines filled with words like urgent, emergency, crisis. At first, I let the silence answer for me. Sitting in my living room, I watched the phone light up and thought how odd it was that for years, no one had reached out to me unless they needed something. And now, suddenly, I was the center of their universe. When it became clear that I wouldn't pick up, the tone began to shift. The panic in their messages softened into something that looked like affection. David wrote long notes about how much he loved me, how grateful he was for everything I'd done. His wife started sending little check-ins about my health, asking if I was eating well, if I needed company. Even the grandchildren suddenly missed me and wanted to come visit. Sweet notes written in handwriting I knew wasn't theirs arrived in my mailbox. On the surface, it all looked like love, but underneath, it was desperation dressed up as devotion. For years, I would have fallen for it. I would have let my heart swell with relief, telling myself they finally saw me, finally valued me. But this time was different. I read their words. I watched their sudden sweetness, and all I could feel was the hollowness behind it. I knew exactly what they wanted, and it wasn't me, it was my money. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades of pouring myself out for them, it took cutting them off to make me visible. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as the key to their comfort. That realization stung, but it also clarified everything. They even showed up at my door one evening, unannounced, their smiles wide, their voices dripping with forced warmth. I stood there, listening, nodding politely, while inside I repeated a single truth: this isn't real. They don't mean it. And for the first time, I didn't feel weak for thinking it. I felt strong. I didn't give in. I didn't restart the payments, no matter how many sweet words or pleading glances they threw my way. I held my ground, quiet but unshakable, because I knew this wasn't the end. If the affection didn't work, the anger would come next. And deep down, I could already feel it building, waiting for the moment it would explode into the open. When David finally confronted me, it didn't happen behind closed doors. No. He chose a Sunday afternoon when the family was gathered in his backyard. The autumn air carried a sharp edge, and I remember the way the neighbors' curtains shifted ever so slightly, as if they too were waiting for the spectacle. He stormed toward me, voice already raised, laced with anger and desperation. To him, I had become the villain, cruel, ungrateful, betraying my own blood. Every accusation spilled out like poison, words meant to cut me down in front of everyone. He painted himself as the victim, talking about all the ways I had abandoned them, how I was ruining his family's future. I could feel the heat of his rage, see the embarrassment flicker across my grandchildren's faces, and sense the uneasy shifting of relatives seated nearby. For years, I had swallowed moments like this, shrinking, apologizing, trying to make peace at my own expense, but not anymore. I let him vent, his voice growing louder, his face flushed with frustration. My silence wasn't weakness this time, it was deliberate. I stood tall, letting the storm pass over me. When the moment came, when the air was thick and the crowd held its breath, I finally drew in mine. I didn't shout. I didn't match his anger. I simply spoke, steady and clear, with all the weight of the truth I had carried for years. I told him about the countless checks I had written, the sacrifices I had made when no one else noticed, and the birthdays, holidays, and dinners where I sat invisible, treated like a sponsor rather than a mother. I laid bare how loyalty had been twisted into servitude, how my love had been taken for granted until there was nothing left but expectation. My words were not loud, but they were sharp, slicing through the air more effectively than any shouting ever could. And then came the twist. I hadn't anticipated the shift in the room. I could feel it. The sympathy that David expected to rally toward him had begun to turn. Neighbors, cousins, even his own children glanced at me differently, as if for the first time they saw not a bitter old woman withholding money, but a mother who had been pushed too far, finally daring to stand her ground. For once, David was left speechless. His hands trembled with anger, but no words came. The power he had held over me for decades evaporated in that moment, slipping through his fingers like water. I felt something unshackle inside me, relief, strength, and yes, even a kind of quiet triumph. I didn't need to win the argument. The truth had already spoken for itself. Without another word, I turned and walked away, the crisp leaves crunching under my shoes, my heart steady in my chest. That was the day the balance shifted for good. And as I walked, I knew I was stepping into a new chapter, one where I would no longer live in the shadow of guilt and obligation, but finally in the light of my own freedom. Now, all that remained was to reflect on what this battle had taught me, and what peace might look like on the other side. The dinner table was set like a stage, every detail polished as if love could be arranged with candles and fine silverware. I sat quietly, letting them think their act was working. David spoke too sweetly, his wife laughed too loudly, and the grandchildren, poor things, were nudged into telling me how much they missed me. On the surface, it looked like a family gathering, but beneath it, I felt the weight of performance, every gesture rehearsed. I kept my hands folded in my lap, nodding as though I believed, inside. I measured every second, waiting for the right moment. They thought the warmth would melt me back into compliance. They thought my silence meant surrender. What they did not see was the calm before a storm that was mine to command. As dessert was served, I reached into my bag. The air shifted when I placed the envelope on the table. My heart did not race. It slowed. With steady hands, I drew out the papers, the certificate proving my mental clarity, the investigator's report detailing their plan, and the guardianship petition they had been preparing behind my back. The room went still. The grandchildren's eyes widened, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. David's face drained of color. His wife's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. I spoke not in anger, but in truth. I laid bare the years of sacrifice, the checks written without question, the birthdays and holidays I poured my heart into. Then, I let the evidence speak for itself. It was no longer my word against theirs. It was fact, written in black and white, undeniable in front of the very children they had hoped to impress with their act of devotion. The masks they wore cracked in an instant. The love they staged crumbled into silence. I looked around that table one last time and felt a strength I had never known. I did not need to shout. I did not need to plead. The power was in my composure, in the quiet certainty that the truth had finally found its way into the open. As I stood, the silence followed me like a shadow. I walked away from that table not as the woman they thought they could manipulate, but as the woman who had exposed them. The night ended not with their triumph, but with mine, and I knew the final judgment was still to come. I stood in the doorway of the house I had bought for them, my heart steady for the first time in years. The voices of the past, every excuse, every manipulation no longer held me. I told them plainly they had to leave. The home was no longer theirs to occupy. Not on my sacrifice, not on my silence. Watching them gather their things in disbelief, I felt no guilt, only relief. For once, the weight was not on my shoulders. The next step was mine alone. I sat with my lawyer and signed the papers that ended every tie of money between us. No more transfers, no more lifelines for a life they had built on entitlement. And then, the greatest act of my freedom, I instructed that every cent of my $47 million be given to charity. Schools, hospitals, and shelters would now receive what my son and his wife had tried to take through deceit. My life's fortune would no longer be a weapon against me. It would be a gift to people who truly needed it. The silence afterward was unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't empty, it was full of peace, of dignity, of the sound of my own worth finally speaking louder than anyone else's demands. For years I had confused loyalty with servitude, mistaking sacrifice for love. Now I knew the truth. Love without respect is nothing but chains, and gratitude unspoken turns into poison. I thought of the countless nights I spent alone, writing checks in the hope that they might notice me, appreciate me, value me. I thought of the birthday cake that grew stale while I waited for a knock that never came. All of it led here to this clarity, to this liberation. Betrayal had been my teacher, but empowerment became my answer. I lost the illusions I once clung to, but I gained myself. That trade was worth everything. My son may never forgive me, but I finally forgave myself for waiting too long, for giving too much, for being afraid to claim the life I deserved. And to you listening, I want you to remember this respect is not optional. It is not a gift you beg for, or something you earn by diminishing yourself. It is the foundation of love, the lifeblood of family. Without it, everything crumbles. If this story touched you, please share it and leave a comment. Remember, respect is not optional. It is a requirement in any family.